Well, hi, everybody. It is such an honor and privilege to be with you today. We're going to jump right into this session to make the most of it, but I'll just do a quick introduction. My name is Amanda Nickerson. I am employed by the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce and State Support Team 9, where I primarily support grantees and provide coaching and professional development across the state. I'm really excited to be with you today, so welcome. All right, so we are going to start by talking a little bit about those standard shifts that happened around 2010 when the Common Core came into fruition. So if we can think back, all of the items on this list were significant shifts and punctuations when we saw the Common Core come into existence. Now, if you look really closely at the three highlighted words or phrases on the slide, these are three relevant concepts that relate to vocabulary that we're going to look a little bit more closely at during this presentation. So we saw greater emphasis on academic language, challenging texts, and using multiple texts to build knowledge and concepts and language. And so I want you just to stop and think before we delve much further into this presentation and ask yourself, it's been 14 years since the Common Core came into existence. Are you seeing these shifts intentionally and cohesively applied inside and outside of the English language arts classroom? And I just want you to kind of do an internal self-check of why or why not. You might just kind of go down that list and check it off in your mind. Do you see those things happening? Kind of yes or no. Now, as we move ahead here, I want to draw your attention to a really helpful IES practice guide, providing reading interventions for students in grades 4 through 9. And I want to draw your attention to a quote by Sharon Vaughn, and really just this last section of it, because I think it provides a why for why we're even having this conversation and why this work is so very important. She says, so much of the curriculum in grades 4 through 9 and beyond requires the ability to read and understand increasingly complex texts. And we know that this is true. The demands accelerate really from 3rd grade and beyond, but especially by the time our students reach middle school and high school and are engaging with many disciplinary texts. But there are lots and lots of hidden assumptions in these texts that our students encounter. And so what you're looking at right now is an excerpt from our Ohio State test from several years back. And you can see that passage number 1 was from the 1941 State of the Union Address for Freedoms by Franklin Roosevelt. And what I want to point out over the next couple slides here is just a little bit of context for why this is so important and why it's important whether you teach ELA or whether you teach, science or social studies or math. And as we think about state tests, right, they're really looking at proficiency. So have you met grade level expectations or graduation requirements? So when we look at this passage here, you can see that there are certain things that are presumed that if you possess certain kinds of background knowledge, you will do better. Or if you lack those background knowledge, you will do a little worse on a test like this. So if you know human rights and freedoms or a little bit about World War II or democracy or national policy, you're going to fare a little bit better on this assessment of reading. If you have a better understanding of syntax and the way that that operates and the rules that constrain our language, you're going to do a little better on a test like this, right? If you understand how transitions work, if you understand how appositives work, if you understand reference and phrases and clauses and all of those things. And then, there are also a lot of presumptions in terms of the words that kids can read as well. So once we get down to that word level, there's an expectation that students are able to read words that contain the 6 syllable types and that they're able to read words that contain morphology. And we know that those words that contain morphemes are really rich content-specific words often as well. So I, on this slide, took another passage from the Ohio State test, and this one is just a fourth grade passage. And what I've done is black out every multisyllabic word. And so it's an overblown example to some degree. But what I want to show is what this is like for a student who can't access the words, who can't decode those meaning-bearing words in a text. And I want you to think about on the left-hand side how this illustrates the fact that it's going to be very challenging to read a complex text if you can't read those words. But I want you to look to the right of this slide and realize that what you're looking at are the directions to a question assessing your knowledge of that text. And so those same constraints are here, right? If I can't read the multisyllabic words, I'm going to struggle through this text. And then I'm also going to struggle with answering questions and demonstrating understanding of this text. And so it's a double-edged sword that our students are dealing with when they are when they still have some word level deficits. So I want you to get a feel for this a little bit. We're going to play a really fun game called Guess the Missing Words. And I want you just to read this to yourself and see if you can fill in the missing blanks here. See if you can figure out which words might be missing. And I'll just give you a few moments to do that. All right. And just so that I can see that the wheels are turning, if you feel like putting a word in here for the first line, show me what you think that might be for those of you who are attending live. Everybody knows that blank have a way of blank in the world. Does anyone have any idea what that first word might be? Do you think this is fun? Do you think this is challenging? Do you have any idea what this passage is about? Now, I want you to check. I'm seeing meteors coming in the chat. That's a good guess. Meteors come crashing down on our heads from a blue sky. I'm seeing thunderstorms. Those are all viable guesses. Cats, right? Ideas. I'm getting lots of answers coming my way. So you can notice if you're listening in, whether you're with me or whether you're listening to the recording, there's an array of different kinds of words here. Somebody went with enemies, which is kind of more of a metaphorical kind of relational conflict, right? And so what I want you to do is take a look at this next slide and see how you did. It says, everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise, okay? So I had one person at the very end as I started transitioning who put diseases into the chat. So they were pretty close, right? But we had cats, we had thunderstorms, we had enemies, we had lots of different guesses that were a little further away from that, right? And so I want you to think about the implications of that for instruction. When we have kids who are still struggling with word level difficulties, the scaffolds that might need to be in place to support them through the text that they're reading and help them access these complex texts and ideas that we want them to read and engage with. So I'm going to move on to this next slide, and I want you to think about this kind of premise that we've been exploring. This idea that what's tested tends to be what we emphasize instructionally. And on this slide, you see, let's call him a middle schooler. And his teacher has been teaching a lot of vocabulary and comprehension and writing, mostly in response to reading. But when he read that passage on the last slide, he said, there have been as many plagues as wars. That's how he read, there have been as many plagues as wars. And so he might be thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. I know that teeth can have plaques. I know you can get a plaque for achievements, but what does that have to do with this, right? So even if you're having trouble with just one word, it can be really confusing for readers. And so what I want to illustrate with this simple concept, with this simple depiction is this idea that even in middle school and high school, we have students with really persistent word reading difficulties. And you can see that little crack in the foundation here, right? So we're focusing a lot on vocabulary and comprehension and writing, but our students are struggling with that because they're missing some of those foundational skills. And I want you to notice how tall I made the staircase here for a moment too, because what I want you to notice is we're basically, if we're not teaching that, if we're not at least providing some scaffolds in our core instruction, we're basically asking these students to pull themselves up by their bootstraps to pass the test or to do our classroom assignments. And so I want to show you an alternative, and it's kind of the premise for what we're talking about today, and that is creating really solid footing for our students, right, through skill development, making sure that one, they're receiving the interventions that they need in another setting. If there are some word reading difficulties that have been persisting, but two, that we are also providing some scaffolds for these students in our core instruction so that students who struggle with phonemic awareness, with phonics, with spelling, morphology, those layers of language, and maybe still have some challenges with fluency, are able to access the vocabulary because they can decode the words when they encounter them in print, that they're able then to comprehend the text that they're reading, and that they can write in response to that text. When those steps are not there, it's a really precarious situation for our students. So I'm going to quickly go through some basics of reading science with you just to ground us in that a little bit too. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the simple view of reading, this idea that reading comprehension is the product of all of these other skills and strategies that we teach students. And so students need to be able to have sufficient word recognition. They need to decode the words. They need to be able to break them apart in those multisyllabic words to arrive at a pronunciation, but they also need a sufficient language comprehension. Once they have read those words, once they have decoded those words, we want to make sure that they understand what they mean and that they can understand what it means within the context that they're appearing. And we also know that Scarborough's rope breaks this down in a slightly different way and helps us think about all of the intricacies of this, right? When I see Scarborough's rope within this context, this is how I think about it. Those bottom strands that have to do with word recognition, they are the same demands no matter what text you're reading, essentially. We have to be able to understand how those letters and sounds correspond. We need to be able to decode the words that we're reading. We want to have increasingly greater sight recognition. But the language comprehension strands become a lot more nuanced, right? So the types of words that we encounter might be slightly different or more domain specific. The background knowledge that we're acquiring is going to be very content saturated, right? What we want is for all of this to integrate. We want those word recognition skills to become increasingly more automatic. We want the language comprehension skills to become increasingly more strategic and interwoven together. But if we ignore those bottom strands because we are trying to teach the content up top, again, we can end up with a frayed rope, and we can have students who struggle mightily to learn the information that we really want them to learn. The other way I want to frame this is thinking about this increasing specialization that occurs in high schools and middle schools especially, right? So we assume and we hope through good instruction that students are learning those basic literacy skills in elementary school. So they're learning foundational skills like decoding and print concepts. They're developing a robust high-frequency word bank. They're learning about basic punctuation and things like that. The students who continue to struggle with that, right, they should be receiving interventions, but we shift our focus in core instruction to intermediate literacy skills. So over time, right, as early as the intermediate grades, we're starting to shift our focus more toward decoding multisyllabic words, improving reading fluency, expanding vocabulary, exposing our students to, again, increasingly advanced text. So while we're doing that, and we're teaching basic literacy skills, the texts keep getting more and more complex and more context saturated, as I call it. So that is kind of the pinnacle of disciplinary literacy, recognizing that The text in science differ a little bit from the text in history, which differ a little bit from the text in ELA, in the intent of the text, the language of the text, often the organization of the text, the lenses that we view the text through, right? And so all of that has importance, but you'll notice that no matter what is at the foundation here of this pyramid, it's still all dependent on having strong basic literacy skills and being able to access the text that we're putting in front of our students. So this is the last way I want to frame this before we go a little bit into the meat and potatoes of this. I want you to think about increasing specialization a different way. And this is by J.C. Ippolito and colleagues. And what they've done is show, instead of just thinking about this as a hierarchical organization where the basic literacy skills are at the bottom, your intermediate skills are in the middle, and then your disciplinary literacy skills are at the top. This shows how it ebbs and flows over time. So I start with basic literacy skills in kindergarten, and that continues for some time. But notice that there are some intermediate skills that start to fold in early on. We're focused on vocabulary from the very beginning, but the peak for basic literacy in kindergarten is really quite high, right? Intermediate literacy kind of stretches across this whole span from kindergarten to 12th grade, where we're developing fluency and vocabulary and those general literacy skills. But it peaks at around 6th grade, where that is a point of emphasis. And then you can see disciplinary literacy stretching across this entire K-12 continuum as well. But again, it peaks at 12th grade, where we see a lot of specialization in those content area texts and the vocabulary that students are interacting with. So what I want to point out before we start talking about what we do to support students is just, again, punctuate this idea that many of us for some time have been putting the carts before the horse with our adolescent learners. We've been focused on the content, which is good because that's the point, right? We want them to learn our content. But for some of the students, the texts look a lot like that state test I showed you, where everything is kind of unintelligible and inaccessible. So we don't want to focus so much on comprehension that we neglect to scaffold fluency and the accuracy of decoding. We want to remember not to put the carts before the horse, but to really work on shoring up accuracy when we can, supporting fluency when we can, all in service of comprehension and understanding of our content areas. So I want to take a look really briefly at then what makes these complex texts so difficult. Why do we need to give this so much thought? What's going to cause extra challenge for these students? And you'll see lots of different aspects of text complexity on this slide. But if you pay attention to the ones with the check marks in particular, those are 3 elements of text complexity that have a lot to do with vocabulary, right? So texts that are complex tend to lack repetition or overlap or similarity in words and sentences. Something might appear just once in the text. Often, especially as students get older or into content areas, they're going to encounter uncommon vocabulary. And then they're also possibly going to encounter a lack of words or sentences or paragraphs that review or pull things together for the students. So those are all things that we have to contend with when students are reading these texts. As a big picture here, I want to bring us back to these practice recommendations from Vaughn and her colleagues and think about how they intersect with our core instruction, right? How we're going to provide some scaffolds for students to make that text accessible. And I'm going to pause for just one moment before I do that to say I am getting some questions in the chat, and I see them. And I will take a look at them again at the end of the presentation. So I just want to acknowledge that I see your questions, and I will come back to them. So feel free to put them there, but I will get to them later. Okay, so as we look at these practice recommendations, you'll notice that there are four. The first one says to build students' decoding skills so they can read what? Complex multisyllabic words that are found in complex text. We want to provide purposeful fluency building activities to help students read effortlessly. Sometimes that might be taking an excerpt and chorally reading a part of it that you want to punctuate, or that students have historically had challenges over time, year after year. And you want to emphasize using a set of comprehension building practices to help students make sense of the text, things like getting the gist or writing summaries. And then we want to provide students with opportunities to practice making sense of stretched text, those challenging texts that will expose them to challenging ideas and information. And what I want to point out is number 4 is not the only item here. It's not the only recommendation that has to do with complex text. Every single recommendation here has implications for that. We can't expect students to read challenging text and practice making sense of them if they don't have strategies to make that meaning, if they haven't had opportunities to build their fluency and their endurance to get through those texts, and if they can't read the words. So a few of these points I'm going to make, I'm going to kind of touch and go on. We'll spend a little bit more time in certain areas than others. So this is going to be a touch and go slide. And this idea that decoding and fluency obviously matter a lot. So I can take that paragraph that I did with you all earlier on, and I can parse it, right? We can break it up into phrases. We can read it aloud. I might draw from Anita Archer's work. I might put a paragraph up and they might just read the bold words with me, or the phrases that are bold. And again, I can use it as a way to build fluency while also really punctuating key phrases or words or concepts that I want to really draw their attention to. We also know that phonology matters a lot, and that there's not a statute of limitation on training phoneme awareness skills if they're weak. At this age, though, we're going to really support that as much as possible within the context of high quality phonics instruction. So you'll see just a quick little nod to that to the side here. If I have students who are reading the word plague as plague you or plague-oo or something like that, phoneme grapheme mapping can be used strategically to help break down some of these complex orthographic patterns, so that I can point out to them that it is a, g, and that GUE makes a single sound, right? So just a little nod here to the instruction that might need to happen, possibly in an intervention setting, but also can be used opportunistically by well-informed, well-trained teachers if there is a breakdown at that level within core instruction. So I folded the objectives in a little later into this presentation. Now that we have some context, I want to tell you where we're going. What are we going to do, knowing that our challenges are many, and that students have lots of layers of language that they need support with when we're teaching vocabulary. So we're going to spend the remainder of this time together selecting vocabulary for explicit instruction, determining the level of support required for different words, having some conversation around that, talking about providing clear student-friendly definitions, developing a range of examples and non-examples, having a little bit of time to talk about text-dependent questions, and then providing multiple exposures to support retention, talking about what we do after that to really deepen understanding. So I'm going to begin with what I consider the basics, talking about the 3 tiers of vocabulary instruction that Isabel Beck and her colleagues and others have researched over the years. So tier 1 words are typically the ones that kids know. They pick them up usually pretty implicitly from the environment, from TV, from conversations, and so forth. So they might be basic words like book, bed, shirt, rat. They might be idioms and metaphors like once upon a time or avoid like the plague. There might be transparent cognates like hospital and hospital, right? And there are also some fake cognates there, pan and pan. So in one language, it is something that we can cook with. In the other case, it's bread. And those are pretty straightforward, concrete definitions that might warrant a little bit of instruction, especially for English learners, right? We're going to be transparent and explicit about the cognates in our languages. We might need to teach them some of those basic words just because they may not always come to us with that language exposure if they're speaking different languages at home. And we may also need to pay special attention to the idioms and metaphors for English learners as well. But typically we don't need to spend a lot of time on tier 1 examples. Now I'm jumping right to tier 3 examples because these are other words that we might use a little more infrequently depending on our intent for reading. In the content area, these are very heavy, right? And we're going to probably select even more tier 3 examples if we're reading a social studies text or a science textbook or something like that. But they're generally words that occur a little more infrequently, like quaff. They're words that belong to a particular domain of study, so words like savanna, and they're content area words like chloroplast. Now, you're probably most familiar with tier 2 examples, and that's because these are those high utility words that typically show up across texts and conversations, across domains, and they're the kind of words that when we teach them to kids, they stand a good chance of using them in their real life to communicate ideas and concepts. So those are words like avoid, right? Or academic words like evaluate, or content area words like divisor that they are a little bit more commonly used outside of a textbook or a classroom setting. You notice here there are less obvious cognates like difficult and difficile, and then multiple meaning words that warrant some instruction, right? The different meanings of the word plant or key or model. And so what research has shown us again and again is these are the words we want to prioritize for instruction. They're going to take the lion's share of our time, and we're going to strategically select words that might be tier 3 words or possibly tier 1 words with select students like English learners to make sure that students understand the vocabulary that is necessary for understanding those complex texts that we're reading. So typically when I'm in a face-to-face session and I'm doing a presentation like this, I'll invite everyone to highlight a passage or an excerpt from a text. And what I'll do is have them highlight the tier 2 words and underline the tier 3 words. I'm going to show you an example of what that would look like on the next slide. But what I want to frame this around are these tier 2 considerations, right? Like if you're doing a novel study, if you have a text in your class that you've commonly pulled in, how are we making decisions about the words that we're teaching? Are we thinking about whether it's a word whose meaning students are unlikely to know? Because if they don't know it, they may need to be taught it, right? Is it a word that's generally useful, a high utility word that, again, they're going to possibly encounter across different domains or settings? Can the meaning of the word be explained in everyday language? Can you come up with a student-friendly definition using words and concepts that are familiar to students? And again, is its meaning critical for comprehending the passage? Is it something that's really important? And so your paper might look a little bit like this. If I had you do that activity, and you might have highlighted words like uttered and justify and recurring or precautions or modest. Those are words that might occur across different domains, and we might use them in real life. And then there are those more archaic or literary terms that we see sometimes in texts that may fall more into that tier 3 territory. So words like pestilence and humanist and fancied. And I think I want to make one point here with that word fancied too, right? Because it kind of depends on where you live, how you would categorize some of these words. In the United States, we typically don't use the word fancied to talk about the way that we think about ourselves or whether we like something. But across the pond in Great Britain, they do. So all of this is kind of, there is no black and white in terms of what words 100% are a tier 1 word or a tier 2 word. You use your judgment, right? You use your knowledge of the text, of your students, of those critical pieces of content that you're trying to teach to really just prioritize the words that you think those students will need to know to engage with that text. And so what I would do at that point, and what I might ask you just to kind of mentally think about in this virtual space is, do you agree with these categorizations, right? Do you think plague and recurring might be tier 2 words that might be important for students to understand if they're reading the plague? Words like presupposed or precautions or uttered or justify or knack. What about tier 3 words in that passage? I had pestilence and humanist and boogie and fancied. So this kind of illustrates that idea of, once we've curated a list and we've gone through a passage and we've sort of itemized some words that might be interesting to teach, we have to make some hard decisions. If I go back for a moment, I can't teach this many words across 3 paragraphs in a novel. That's a lot. Some of those words are going to need to be taught very quickly and lightly. Other words they're going to have to learn implicitly. And I'm going to have to prioritize the words that I'm going to teach deeply. And that's what I want to point out here. Notice those words that are highlighted, right? Those are the words that I've determined might be more important than some of the others on this list. So I've got to start whittling them down. And then I have to start thinking about how I'm going to actually teach those words. So I want to encompass all of this within the context of text sets, right? This idea that we can use multiple texts on the same topic that are at different difficulty levels to build background knowledge for more difficult texts like the plague. And I want to bring up this point here that this helps students independently deal with the information in that target text while also supporting accuracy and fluency. And it also helps solidify vocabulary terms that occur across multiple texts. So I have created some very strategic examples in here that kind of span maybe more of like a 6th grade level and a 12th grade level, trying to use a single text. I realize the plague is a very advanced text, right? And you'll notice some less advanced vocabulary words. That was intentionally done because what I want for you all to be able to do is see yourselves somewhere in this presentation. I want everyone, regardless of the grade level that you teach, the age of your students, to be able to connect somewhere to the big picture. So what I'm showing you right now is a text set from Achieve the Core. And it just shows, again, that this might be multimodal text. I might have a couple books on a single topic like germs and pestilence. I might have a couple articles about bacteria and why some people evade colds and some don't. And I might even use video strategically. So, the one here says, ask Smithsonian, what's the difference between bacteria and viruses? And those videos and simpler articles can help build background knowledge about this concept so that when we're reading a complex text like the plague, students have some background knowledge. They have some of that mental Velcro that we're hoping to establish in their brains to make all the other learning really sticky. And you can see from one of those passages that were just on that previous slide, there's an article here from NPR. And what I want to point out is, if my vocabulary word is infectious, and I'm teaching that, and I want to pick texts where they're going to see that concept and perhaps that word across multiple texts. But I might also be looking for texts like this that have derivations of that. So I have infections, infect, infectious, all showing up within a couple paragraphs of one another. So I can also teach those morphemically related words in connection with one another to help not only with conceptual understanding, but also really build up their vocabulary prowess. The other point I want to make before we start jumping in a couple lesson pieces is we want to try to pull in some texts that we maybe have previously read as well. So if you read The Plague in 11th grade, and you've read Romeo and Juliet freshman year, you can come back to excerpts like this and embed a little bit of fluency practice. So, here's a refrain. Where the infectious pestilence did reign, sealed up the doors and would not let us forth. Okay. So in full transparency, I couldn't resist the picture of William Shakespeare wearing a mask. That was part of what made this a fun example. But I want you to think about the significance of pulling in a passage like this, an excerpt like this from Romeo and Juliet, right? The fact that the doors were sealed had really big implications for the characters in Romeo and Juliet. It was tragic that the letter was never delivered, right? So we can strategically come back to these concepts, revisit the word infectious. Why was that a problem? Why did that keep them from going out and delivering the letter? What does infectious mean? But then we want to support those narrative texts using what Sarah Lupo calls staircase texts. So we have visual texts like The Plague 101 by National Geographic. We have accessible texts that are written at a slightly lower level or lower complexity level than our main text that we're trying to read. So we might read something like The Black Death from Common Lit. I might jump into a part of the plague before reading a contemporary article about COVID called Disease Detectives, and then going back into the target text. So using a text set like this helps me see some vocabulary, words, and concepts across all of them. It helps build relevance, and it helps support some of those fluency and decoding skills as well while we're building that background knowledge. So many of you are probably familiar with Anita Archer's explicit vocabulary routine. I want to take you through it today with some small tweaks and some examples for you to think about how we can provide some small scaffolds that really make a big difference for our students. So we're going to begin by introducing the word's pronunciation. We'll introduce the word's meaning. We'll illustrate the words with examples and non-examples, and then check for students' understanding. And so I want to take you through what this might look like. I might start by assessing levels of word knowledge of infectious. So show me a number one on a piece of paper, right? They might even just kind of fill out a scale. Younger 6th grade students might just put a number 1 in front of them and show you how familiar they are on a scale of never encountered the word to I'm fluent with this definition and I use it, right? And then I'm going to begin to pre-teach. So I might display the word infectious on a board and face students while I say, this word is infectious. And then I would say the word with me, infectious. What word? And everyone is going to say infectious. And what I've already done is prime the pump for pronunciation, because one hurdle for students in using language is being able to pronounce it and know that they are not going to stumble or mispronounce something that's going to lead to embarrassment. But it also primes the pump for spelling. So I might use syllable boxes to augment this routine. So I might say, tap and say the syllables in infectious. And they can just take their pencil and put a dot in this grid. So they might just do infectious and tap their pencil or make a little circle there for a placeholder for each syllable. So their grid would look a little bit like that. Then I might say the word again, infectious, and direct the students to spell each syllable. So they write in the first box, fect in the second, and shus in the third. And then I would put up an example to have them check and see how it matched up with my example. We could have a conversation and a chance for any corrections that might need to be made or modeling. And then they would write the word to the right of the syllable boxes, just like that. Now, that is a very short process. It doesn't take a whole lot of extra time, and adding those syllable boxes really, it doesn't change much of Anita Archer's original routine, but it does help you with those phoneme grapheme correspondences. And if you look at a word like infectious, it helps you break apart those morphemes and those meaningful parts, which can also set the table for conversations around that later. So the next step in the process, once I've had them pronounce it, maybe break it up into syllables, is to introduce the word's pronunciation. So I will do that. And if I need to, I'm going to provide a cognate for the word. So again, there's infectious and infeccioso in Spanish. And so I would draw connections across those two words explicitly for my English learners, and perhaps explicitly state the part of speech. I wanted to share just a couple examples here from the work of Louisa Moats that give you a framework for some of these formal structured definitions that we will be moving into next. So I've worked on the pronunciations, I've taught cognates where needed. Now I need a definition. For nouns, you can use that category or formula that you see at the top. And then there are different frameworks or sentence stems for verbs and adjectives and adverbs. And I just want you to have that at your fingertips in the handouts. But what I would use for a word like infectious is this one. So to be infectious is to what, such as what. So I'm going to give a related term and I'm going to give an example. And I'm going to say an example like this. To be infectious is to spread a disease easily, such as the bubonic plague. So if a disease is spread easily, it is infectious. And I'm going to have everyone say that again. It can be helpful with words like this to put infectious on the board and parse out those critical attributes of the word. So to spread something that is a disease, but to do that very easily. So all three of those aspects of a disease have to be true for something to be considered infectious. And you can see that at this point, I can take those syllable boxes that I've had them fill out and just add a box underneath them for modified syllable boxes. And so I can very quickly just go through this process of teaching infectious, breaking it apart, adding that student-friendly definition, and I could move on to the next word, such as pestilence, and do the same process. So that's just there as an illustration. But then I need to pre-teach the word. So I want to illustrate the word with examples. So I might use an object or an artifact, a demonstration. I might act out words. I might use that glow germ powder and put it on a ball that looks a little bit like a pathogen and have everybody review some concepts with me as I'm passing it around, or shake their hand as they're coming into the room and strategically show them under a little black light this concept of something being infectious, being spread very easily, and really uncover that concept of the fact that pathogens are invisible to the naked eye. We don't see them, but they're still spreading. And then I can use visual examples if I want. So I might pull up art from the bubonic plague. I could use verbal examples like, because the bubonic plague was so infectious, it spread quickly and killed millions of people. Or an epidemiologist is a doctor who specializes in infectious disease. I might provide examples and synonyms. So an example of infectious diseases are viruses, bacteria, right? Those little microscopic organisms we can see under a microscope. Some examples of some non-examples would be diseases that are non-transmissible. So cancer, heart disease, high blood pressure, right? Diabetes, those are all diseases. They all present challenges, but you can't catch them from somebody else. They're not infectious. I can choose to add another layer here by asking deep processing questions. So I might say, what does it mean if you say someone has an infectious smile? How's this usage different from the common definition of infectious, right? I might have students discern between examples and non-examples. So I can have them read an excerpt from The Red Death and an excerpt from The Fault in Our Stars and tell me which one represents a disease that is infectious, and that would be the Red Death, right? And then which example represents a disease that is non-transmissible, which would be The Fault in Our Stars, where the protagonist has cancer. And then we have opportunities to have them discern between examples and non-examples, perhaps in different ways. So I might say an example, and I want them to use those two words, tell me infectious or non-transmissible. So I would say heart disease, they would say non-transmissible. I would say COVID-19, they would say infectious. And I can also check for understanding by giving them different situations or contexts. So I might have some sentence frames here involving the Black Death or influenza or tuberculosis or COVID-19 and have them fill in that vocabulary word. One thing you don't see here that I typically embed in presentations like this are different conjugations. So I try to add derivational suffixes and things like that would change the function of the word or make it plural. So I might talk about, like, if it's cat for a simple example, right? I might have cats and so forth. One of the things that I also really like that I want to share as you're thinking about this, making connections across words, is an activity called Connect To, where students are asked to make connections between a word on the first list and a word on the second. So you might think about going back to a word that was previously taught in an earlier unit. So we have words like pestilence and infectious, and then you can ask students to make a connection. So how is pestilence connected to infectious? And they might draw a picture or pull in an image from online if they're doing this digitally and write something like, the word pestilence describes any disease that spreads quickly and kills a lot of people, for example, the bubonic plague. Because a pestilence is an infection that spreads easily, it would be considered infectious. So you can see it's an opportunity to kind of come back to some previously taught words or words within possibly even your current unit, just to help them think about how the two words are semantically related. And we also have opportunities to think about the deep roots of the words that we are working with. So fect is the root in infectious. And you can see there are some related words here. We have perfect, perfectly, perfection. And then we have infect, infection, and infectious on another little strand, or affect, affection, affectionate, affectionately. And you also see some of those other, what they call assimilated prefixes, right? The chameleon prefixes that are related. So if we look at thick and fact and fact, we have an even bigger network of words that are related that I could have students interact with, perhaps, depending on the depth of my instruction and my intent. So I want to kind of shift to looking at a couple opportunities here for text-dependent questions, because once we've explicitly taught these words, we've taught their pronunciation, we've given student-friendly definitions, we've given examples and non-examples, we've given them chances to check for understanding, we want to diversify the exposures that students have. So I can create text-dependent questions that perhaps look like some of the assessments they'll see towards the end of the year. So everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. Pestilence means what? Surprises, illnesses, problems, or a fatal disease. And then you can see, another example to the other side using the word figures, which is a multiple meaning word, and having them think about within the context of the story, which definition of figures is being used. That brings us to the importance of using word parts as well. And so we want to help teach generalizable, decoding and vocabulary skills. So we teach them root words because we want them to be able to identify them. So if I've taught fect means to make or do, that is helpful to them when they come across a word like infectious on a test. I'm going to teach them to look for a prefix and think about what it means. So in means in or on. I'm going to have them look for the suffix and think about what it means. In this case, IOUS just is characterized by or full of something. And what they do is they put all these things together to come up with an approximate definition, a working definition to try to buoy them through a text when they come across a word that's previously unencountered. So they could say, okay, infectious might be to cause a living thing to be full of a disease-causing organism, right? Like some sort of a definition, a working definition. And this is important. I remember years ago seeing a release test question that had the word anthropomorphic in it in a story about Arbor Day, where people were emailing back and forth with trees. And anthropomorphic is going to be really tricky if you, one, are a little bit untethered by the fact that people are corresponding with trees via email, and that concept is strange to you. But if you also don't have these skills to make use of the word parts and start to figure out what this all is about. And I couldn't resist the dad joke, so I had to put this in here. A great thing about teaching words like infectious is that there are so many variants, right? There are so many ways that we can teach this word and related words, which helps understanding and vocabulary connections. As we think about using word parts too, I don't know if many of you are familiar with the work of Sandra Dona, but she has several books that deal with building morphemic awareness. So you might think about, depending on the needs of your students or whether you're in a core intervention setting, utilizing a routine like this to kind of prime the pump. You're not putting the text in front of them. They just maybe have some cards that they're manipulating. With older students, I've found using double-sided cardstock to be really helpful. So I take double-sided cardstock, I laminate it, and I cut it into these little squares. And then all they have to do is put them down. And when one morpheme changes, they flip it and it's a different color on the other side. So it doesn't feel babyish. It's not the same manipulatives you've used with younger students, and it doesn't take up much space, and it's pretty inexpensive. So I want you to imagine that these are the double-sided cardstock. And you can see the text because I want you to see what this looks like on the teacher side. But I want you to imagine for the students that they're just putting down these rectangles as you're leading them through this script, sorry. So you might be saying, we are learning the word infectious. What is the final stable syllable in infectious? And they say shus, and they put down that red rectangle. And then you ask, what is the prefix in infectious? And they say in, and they put that green rectangle down. What is the root in infectious? They say fect. And then you lead them through deleting the final stable syllable in infectious and saying the new word infect. And you can tell that red rectangle is gone. Add the final stable syllable shun to infect and say the new word infection. So they're adding another blue rectangle to the end. Add the prefix dis to infection and say the new word, disinfection. And basically, you can keep going with this, give them a variety of words, but what you can do afterwards is really endless. You could have them take the words that you were just manipulating with those cards a moment ago and identify the prefixes and the roots and the suffixes by circling the prefixes and boxing those suffixes and talking about the meanings. How is infectious different from infection? Have them write it in a sentence, right? Have them turn and talk to somebody and use it in a sentence. You could do a root tree like you see on the other side, again, to kind of map out these related words. So what I've done sometimes when I've used this morphemic awareness warm up is I've given the students a list of all the words that we manipulated. I gave them the print, and then I have them sort them on a tree like this into semantically related categories. So which words that we've just worked with are related more closely to one another. And you can have some conversations around that. You could continue to use those syllable boxes. So after a morphemic awareness activity like that, you might have them write out infectious, infect, infection, disinfection, disinfect, and disinfected. And again, talk about what happens when you add IOUS. Well, it makes it an adjective, right? If I add ED to the end of disinfect, it's telling me it happened in the past. It gives you some opportunities to think about precision and when we use each form of these words. And then we also want to think then about long-term usability and multiple exposures to these words. So think strategically about how we use word walls in our classrooms. The one example that you see on this slide shows a vocabulary web that's built around a central root. So you see derm and therm and hypo, which makes me think this is a science example, right? But we have some related words there with the definition. So that's a great way to conceptually map out some of those words for later use and for writing, right? Just to group words that are related in some way. And then you can see a math example there too with some great graphics to support that knowledge of the vocabulary. Much research has supported the use of vocabulary journals. That Marzano has quite a bit to say about that. So we identify, the word or the term, the meaning of the word. We provide a pictorial representation or an image, and then you might take some notes on the word, maybe the context, or use a sentence, right? There's different things that we can do. We want to continue to use a variety of graphic organizers. So the Freyer model is a good one. But I have seen the Freire model used over and over and over again, sometimes when it's not necessarily the best fit for the kinds of words that you're working with either. So we want to be discerning about when we're having students write out that definition and draw the picture and provide synonyms and antonyms and use it in a sentence, because sometimes semantic mapping is more helpful, showing those relationships across different words. Sometimes semantic feature analysis is important to look at the characteristics of a thing. What makes a quadrilateral different from a square or a rectangle or a rhombus, right? What makes a mammal different from a bird, different from a reptile? I sometimes might want to use a graphic organizer for scaling or semantic gradients to be able to show that shades of meaning from frigid to scorching. I might want to categorize words, or again, use some concept mapping or mind mapping. And then because we are talking about those continued and really accelerating word level demands in complex text, we also want to think about morphology and syllabication and how we can continue to support that. So some of the things that you saw in this presentation were the root tree and the syllable boxes, but word matrices are another viable option that you may want to take a look at if you haven't been already incorporating that into your instruction. And then we want to think about how we incorporate this into our writing and our speaking and listening opportunities, so that we are giving students chances to work and talk with their peers as well. So when we are incorporating vocabulary into writing, we can strategically use some sentence stems, some paragraph frames. We can have them write very purposeful paragraphs that release some of those scaffolds eventually, that put the full burden of writing on our students. We can have them use of vocabulary notebooks. Some of the examples for how we might frame this would be asking them to come up with examples or questions or connections and write or speak about that. So why would you try to avoid infectious diseases? Would you want to be an infectious disease doctor, right? Describe a time when you had something that was infectious. Explain how these words are related: infectious and pestilence. If someone is infectious, would he or she feel energetic, right? Why would someone want to be a doctor who specializes in infectious diseases? You get the idea, right? There are all these different ways that we get them to think about these words that we're teaching critically and in connection with other concepts and ideas. And then we also want to make use of lots of different structures to keep this work going deeper and foster understanding of our content. So we want to engage students in academic conversations. We can use things like Socratic circles or jigsaws, accountable talk, right? Using partners A and B to turn and talk and have some structured responses about the words. We can engage in debates. The opportunities are really, really endless. But the big point is, we don't want to stop with teaching it explicitly one time, giving them examples and non-examples one time, and never, ever using the word again. The goal is to put this permanently into their mental dictionary so that it does come out in their speech, in their writing, and so that the next time they hear it spoken by somebody else or encounter it in print, they're equipped to understand it and do something with the knowledge that it supports. So there are just a few instructional implications that I just want to drive home before we open things up for Q&A. And the big takeaways are, we want to select our vocabulary words very intentionally. We want to make sure that we're thinking about the ones that are going to give us the most mileage, the most utility. And we need to think about, as you think about all these routines and the multiple exposures that we've just kind of gone through, we need some discernment as educators to determine when a student simply needs to recognize a word in text to know what it is, or when it's concrete enough that I can give it a light touch, and when a word really needs to be known and needs to be known at deep levels and in its relationships with other words and concepts. And then we are going to utilize all of these different strategies in this presentation to make sure that we give them opportunities for application. And then I have lots of references for you. I'm going to pull this up and just leave it here for a moment so you all can see my contact information if you want a screenshot. And I'm going to open the floor for any questions.